So we're going to be talking about understanding sort of what's behind the, from an organizational point of view, from the information security business, so what's happening and what's driving the information security business, both from the point of view of the organization, but also from the supporting organizations, so typically vendors and consulting firms. Helping out, so there's human issues, so people, there's issues relating to the data, and there's issues that relate to the business itself and how it functions in its ecosystem. So the key driver of information systems, information security relating to information systems must be risk management. So the process of identifying, assessing, prioritizing, and addressing the risks that the organization faces. So it really has to be a strategically driven initiative. In this way, when it's driven by risk management, we can ensure that we're planning to appropriately deal with the risks that may affect our organization. So typically, and if you remember from previous lectures, we're looking at the potential threats. We're looking to identify the vulnerabilities. We're thinking about, the possibility, the probability, or here mentioned as the opportunity that a threat has to exploit a vulnerability. And the result of the exploitation of the vulnerability by the threat, this is where the risk is. So when there is an impact, then the risk materializes. Again, here, something that we've talked about before. We've also looked at different methodologies, right? The methodologies are the methods, the way that we're going to deal with these, and we're going to identify the threats, the vulnerabilities, the impact, and we're going to do this in a structured way, and in helping us to create our risk registry, or where we're going to have all this information. So the risk register, which is something that we've alluded to in previous lectures, is going to contain a description of the risks, the expected impact if the associated event occurs, the probability of the event occurring, the steps to mitigate this risk, the steps to take should the event occur, and how we're going to rank this risk, or how we're going to prioritize this risk in our organization. From the exercises and activities that we've been doing, and in this course we've been developing scenarios. So the risk registry is going to be a list of all our different scenarios in this context. We're going to, as part of our security business, we're going to implement we're going to do a business impact assessment, the BIA. We're going to do a business continuity plan, and we're going to have a disaster recovery plan. So how are we going to be protecting the organization and our resources if something that occurs that could potentially impact our normal business functions? So in the BIA, we're going to analyze the functions of the organization, and we're going to look at the critical activities that we need to maintain, and the non-critical activities that obviously are going to require less protection. So this is really going to help us to identify what needs more protection in the organization. We're going to set the recovery point objectives, recovery time objectives, the business recovery requirements, the technical recovery requirements. Again, we're going to go quickly because we talked about that in the previous lecture. We're going to make a written plan on how this is going to happen, and this plan is going to identify who's going to be doing what, how this is going to work, what are going to be the priorities, and of course, always keeping in mind that the first priority is the safety and the well-being of the people that are affected by this. Then number two, the continuity of critical business functions and operations, and then the continuity of the IT infrastructure components within the 7 domains of our IT infrastructure that have been discussed before. And so the elements of the BCP, the Business Continuity Plan, are going to include policy statements. They're going to include assigning project team members would have defined roles and responsibilities, our emergency response procedures, and how we're going to protect life, safety, and infrastructures. situation and damage assessment process, resource salvage and recovery process, and then alternate facilities or triage for short-term or long-term emergency mode of operation and business recovery. As part of the DRP, the Disaster Recovery Plan, we're going to define what we consider to be a disaster. So, and understanding that this is an event that affects multiple business processes for an extended period, and which cause substantial resource damage that we must address before we can resolve the business process interruption. So in the DRP, we're going to include specific steps and procedures to recover from a disaster. This is going to be part of our business continuity plan, but it's going to extend it and support it as well. So the DRP is going to have threat analysis, impact scenarios, recovery requirement documentation, and the disaster recovery process. We're going to think about, how we're going to do it. Are we going to have a hot site, a warm site, a cold site, a mobile site like trailers, as we've discussed before. So in the process of assessing risk, there's multiple methodologies that are mentioned here, and they're mentioned in the book. Things like CRAM or Octave or NIST, the Risk Management Guide, as well as there's part of the ISO 27000 standard, which is ISO 27005. To various degrees, they propose the same basic strategy that we've been discussing in this course. Again, we've done some of these already by now, by the time you must be going through this lecture. So you should have some good understanding of what these are. And whatever the organization, it's going to choose a methodologies, and these are the most common methodologies used in the US. Not so much in Canada and in Quebec. We have other methodologies. But whatever one that is used, obviously you'd require to get a significant amount of training to be familiar with it. But the basic concepts are the ones that we've talked about. But really, the whole point of the risk analysis is to identify where we are now from a risk management point of view and where we want to be in an ideal scenario, and then sort out a plan on how we're going to bridge this gap, how we're going to identify, the difference between where we are and where we need to be. And so that's our security gap. And we're going to try to analyze that, and then we're going to try to do something about it. So we're going to identify the applicable elements of the security policy and other standards. We're going to assemble policy, standards, procedures, and guideline documents. We're going to review and assess implementation of policy, standards, and guidelines. We're going to collect hardware and software inventory information. Then we're going to interview users to assess knowledge and compliance with policies. We're going to compare the current security environment with the policies. We're going to prioritize identified gaps for resolution. Then we're going to document and implement remedies to conform to the policies. We're going to be looking at compliance, again, something that we've discussed in the previous lecture. So we're going to identify what are the compliance requirements or the laws that we need to adhere to or to comply with. And we're going to create a plan. We're going to put in place a plan on how we're going to do that. We're going to look at the confidentiality issues and the privacy issues and how private information are, from an organizational point of view, private information, we have a requirement to keep that information confidential. So confidentiality is our objective, and privacy is one of the justifications of a certain amount of confidentiality for the data that we're maintaining. So how we're going to do that, right, and how we're going to put that in place is through confidentiality in our organization. Those being, if you remember, again, discussed before, the tenets of information security, so the CIA, or the confidentiality, integrity, and availability that are driving us. So in keeping private data confidential, we're going to be using things like user IDs and password, and these are things that need to be kept confidential. Smart cards and tokens, biometric devices, digital certificates as well. Challenge response handshakes, Kerberos, or different types of password that are going to be used. So they are all going to have their place in different parts of the organization and on how we're operating. As far as mobile workers are concerned, and the fact that they maybe use their personal devices, this is something that we want to enable because it's a key element on how we can ensure continuity of business. We're seeing it with COVID, for example, a lot of people working from home. So, it's a very useful thing as well. Mobility is important. We want more and more employees expect to be able to be working out from their office, teleworking or other things like that. So, but we need to have mechanisms in place for that. As well, the BYOD, the bring your own device, particularly we see it with phones as well. So we need to take that under consideration when we're developing our strategy, because there's a lot of concerns, things like data ownership, who owns the data, how we manage viruses on these home platforms. Are we going to supply an antivirus software to our employees? Think of the universities. A lot of universities are providing antivirus software to students because they recognize that their own devices that they're using are an incredible source of viruses coming into the university's environment. How we're going to support the ownership of different technologies, making sure that the individuals have the technologies that they need to be able to do the job they do. What about all the privacy issues? Like, think of webcams for invigilation, a big debate that's been going on in the last few months at the university. This is a big concern for organizations, not just for the university, for all kinds of businesses as well. What about user acceptance? What about the legal concerns of having people do business work on personally owned machines? Who does the work belong to? So we need to worry about a lot of endpoint devices and device security issues about all these BYOD and this mobile environment. Encryption of devices, encryption of data. A device that gets stolen, someone can read the data that's on it. Can we encrypt this data? So how do we do that? We have mechanisms in place, but we need to be able to enable that and make that a part of our global strategy. What about removable storage like USB drives? I mean, USB drives today are incredibly large. They can have a tremendous capacity to store information. So these are all the things that we need to take under consideration when we're thinking about how we're going to run, how this Chief Information Security Officer, the CISO, is going to be running the business of IT. So again, here this is in relation to the course manual, the course book, and a lot of the concepts that are being presented in this lecture, which is part of the week, the topics covered this week, really are relating back to a lot of things that we have actually covered in the last few weeks, and try to tie a lot of these concepts together. So we'll be discussing that further in the weekly Zoom session. Thank you.